Well, we know from the book of Acts, as it ends, that Paul was under house arrest for approximately 2 years. And during that time, as we talked about in a previous class, he had written a number of letters. And at that point, where the book of Acts ends, we have to start putting the rest of Paul's life into context by pulling different pieces from different places. There is no one place in Scripture that clearly outlines what happened next. For a variety of reasons, we can assume that Paul was released from house arrest. He was there for 2 years. He preached boldly and without hindrance. And then it appears he continued his ministry. A couple of reasons why we can assume this. First, at this point, around the year 59, the Roman government's attitude was relatively positive towards Judaism, and Rome considered Christianity a subset of Judaism. So Rome was not persecuting Christians at that point, at least not on a governmental basis. So it's possible that Rome found him innocent and simply let him go. There was no persecution happening. We also know from the prison letters that we looked at in the previous class, we also know that Paul expected to be released. If you'll remember from Philemon, when he wrote to his friend, he said, "Get the guest room ready because I'm going to come and visit you." All of Paul's letters from that time were upbeat and positive and seemed to expect continued ministry. And then what happens with the next letters is his attitude changes. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are called the pastoral epistles, or the pastor letters. They're called that because Timothy and Titus were both young pastors who had been shepherded, trained under Paul, and they contain information that is not consistent with previous travels. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. 2 Timothy in particular has a completely different tone. In 2 Timothy, it's obvious that Paul does not expect to be released. So the prison letters that we talked about in our last class are upbeat, they're optimistic, get the guest room ready. Then the other letters change. So it appears that he was released and then began to do some more ministry, including writing to Timothy and Titus. And then finally, we know from history, not from Scripture, but from other history, that there's all kinds of tradition and stories about what Paul did later. Certainly, history is not to be equated with Scripture, but it does give us some information. And so our assumption is Paul was under house arrest for 2 years and then was released. Either his accusers from Jerusalem simply never showed up, and so there was no trial and he was released, or he was found innocent. Well, remember that 2 years prior to that, he'd been put on trial in Jerusalem and he'd been put on trial in Caesarea, and they kept finding him innocent. He was only being tried in Rome because he'd appealed to Caesar. So it's possible that he was found innocent and released. Well, at that point, then, we have to make some educated assumptions about where and when and how he traveled. Most likely, his immediate goal was to get to Colossae to visit Philemon. Remember again, in Philemon, he said, "Get the guest room ready, I'm coming to see you." So what probably happened was he was released from Rome, and then he made his way towards the province of Asia where he could visit Philemon. Along the way, he would have stopped in the island of Crete. We know that because in Titus chapter 1, Paul says to Titus that he left him in Crete while he was traveling. So our best approach is to say he left Rome, he traveled to Crete where they visited for a little while, he left Pastor Titus to help figure things out at the church there in Crete, and then Paul continued on to probably Ephesus next. That was the major city in Asia. And we know in 1 Timothy chapter 1 that Paul said he left Timothy in Ephesus. So Paul went from Rome to Crete to Ephesus, and then he would have gone on to Colossae to visit Philemon. And then it tells us he traveled to Philippi again. So at this point, it looks like Paul is simply visiting the churches that he had planted. He's encouraging leaders. This really we can now consider his fourth missionary journey. He spent some time around the area of Philippi, and then we believe he headed all the way across to the other side of the Roman Empire to visit Spain. Specifically in Romans chapter 15, verse 24, he tells the Romans that he's planning to visit Spain. So we know that was on his agenda. It was something he wanted to do. We don't know, at least not from Scripture, what he did. Paul's ministry tended to look very similar wherever he went. He would find a synagogue or a church. He would teach, he would shepherd, he would lead people to Christ, and he would stay for a little while to strengthen the church, and then he would move on. It's possible that 1 Timothy and Titus, those two letters, were written while he was in Spain. That's uncertain, but it's a strong possibility. At which point, our focus will change to take a look at what's going on with the rest of the Roman Empire.